Hi, my name is Nathan Sigworth. I'm the CEO of PharmacCCX. We leverage technology to help pharma companies and payers manage the negotiation and administration process of access agreements for drugs. Today is our next installment of Contingently Committed, our video series where we interview experts in the field to learn about the latest advancements at the intersections of technology, finance, and pharmaceuticals. Today, we're going to talk with my friend and advisor, Brian O'Rourke. Brian, thanks for joining us.
Oh, thank you very much. Pleased to be here.
So tell us a little bit about what you've done and your background.
Well, I'm a pharmacist by education. Spent a number of years in the early part of my career in clinical practice, mostly hospital-based. And I spent a fair bit of time in the Canadian military health services, progressing through the ranks there to a colonel. I did my Doctor of Pharmacy degree at the University of Toronto from 94 to 96, which gave me a lot of interest in both advanced clinical practice, but some of the emerging fields of cost effectiveness and research associated with providing payers and decision makers with good evidence on the value of new drugs, new technologies, etc. When I left the military in 2008, there was an opportunity at CADTH, a very difficult acronym at times to say, CADTH, the Canadian Agency for Drugs and Technologies in Health. So I spent about 11 years at that agency as the President and Chief Executive Officer and retired in July 2020, just in the midst of the pandemic. Since leaving CADTH, I've maintained an interest in the field of health technology assessment. I do some volunteer work with ISPOR as the chair of their HTA Council and with CIRS, the Center for Innovation and Regulatory Sciences. Enough about me.
Very cool. Very cool. So you basically have this front row seat at how the world is thinking about health technology assessment. What changes, what advances have you seen? What are some of the things that you've seen recently that are of note? And what do you expect as we move forward in the world of HTA?
Yeah, I think I won't speak just recently. There's a bit of a story here if we go back, say, 5 years or even 10 years in the field of HTA. HTA has got about a 35-year history. What we did see, however, was there were about 8-9 different definitions for HTA by the experts themselves. Every region seemed to create their own definition. So one of the things that I tried to do from 2014 to 2018, I was chair of the board of directors for INATA, the International Network of Agencies for Health Technology Assessment. We decided to work together with the society called HTAI to try and bring together all of these experts, all of the associations that had an interest in HTA to come up with a globally accepted definition. In March of 2020, we published this new definition. Let me talk about pharmaceuticals. In the space of pharmaceuticals, the early part of the 2000s was kind of a really bad decade for the pharmaceutical industry. They were seeing the patent cliff. A lot of the drugs that they were bringing to market were these Me Too type products that really weren't offering additional good clinical value. And the HTA agencies and regulators were starting to come to the manufacturers and say, look, you've got to really start working on true innovation if you're looking to bring something to patient care. Well, they did. So we really started to see a growth in the pipelines of these very promising new technologies, new drugs. So the pipelines were starting to burst. We also saw that patients and the clinicians, the physicians that were treating the patients, were starting to demand early and equitable access to all of these new innovations, these new drugs. And that was putting pressure on the HTA bodies and the payers to really reach out to start engaging the patient community, the clinical community better. We were seeing more niche drugs. So in these areas of rare diseases, very small patient populations, limited evidence to make our decisions, but a lot of promise in areas where there was significant unmet need for patients. So, and the other thing that we started to see was the price of drugs was growing exponentially. And this was creating a lot of pressure from an affordability perspective on governments and even private payers globally. So those were some of the key trends that we started to see. And based on that, we also felt that there was a need to evolve the field of health technology assessment.
So, I think some of this is very, very pressing. Even this week, you had the US FDA approve this new Biogen. If you have any thoughts on this recent news?
Yeah, I have a lot of thoughts on it. That to me is the ultimate extreme in some of the challenges that we're facing, where a regulator, one of the largest regulators, the Food and Drug Administration in the United States, provided approval to a drug, aducanumab, for Alzheimer's disease with what most would refer to as failed clinical trials, and a drug that actually has the potential for some very severe adverse effects. Now, it wouldn't be fair for me to comment too much on this because I haven't delved into the actual clinical studies, et cetera. But it's a good reflection of how drugs are being approved. And when they're approved, there's a lot of uncertainty as to the value that new drug will bring both to patients and to health systems. What price are we going to use for this, and will that drive us away from other drugs or other clinical areas or other tax programs where we would be better to spend our limited resources? During 2020, we did a quick survey at each of these roundtables to see if the challenges were similar in countries around the world or if there were some key differences, and what were those trends that we were seeing. So it was all about the challenges and opportunities of COVID-19 for the HTA community. And the big 5 kind of areas that we saw were speed, that governments, payers, decision makers wanted advice from the HTA community as quick as possible. Yeah. And that was really stressing our ability to do a rigorous or a very, a review of quality. That I think is a trend that's going to stay, that we are going to have to look for ways to do our work smarter so that decision makers can make their decisions on these new technologies.
No, it's interesting. The demand for speed, and that brings this uncertainty to the table. What new approaches, what new tools, or old tools have you seen used, and how are those emerging and how are those changing?
Yeah, it's a really good point. We just recently published a paper on that survey that we did through ISPOR. And one of the comments we made in the article was too many people were dying, hospitals were overflowing, and economies were crashing. Governments and public health officials were under extreme pressure to remedy the situation with a prevailing attitude for them to just do something. And that was what we were seeing everywhere around the world. So to me, it was actually just a reflection of what had started probably 5 years ago with the speed versus rigor quality issue. And that we started to have to look at rather than a binary decision on a new drug or a new technology where at a point in time we say yes or we say no, to a much more iterative process where we look at that drug or that technology over its life cycle, pre-market, on-market, post-market. And with that, we then have to have the appropriate tools. To me, to make this life cycle approach work, we really had to engage the payer community in a much more active way. Rather than giving them recommendations, we had to give them support to implement some of those recommendations. And it probably was going to require conditional reimbursement recommendations, the collection of evidence in that post-market space, reassessing the technologies, renegotiating the price, and probably putting into place performance-based contracting, which would help share the risk for all of the key stakeholders involved. Now, to do that, there's a lot of administrative burden on very busy government people. Are there platforms or are there third parties that might come and help? And that's where I got interested in PharmaCCX and some of the things that your company was offering.
There's also, you and I have talked also about the importance of standards, right? The outcomes-based contracting has become a bit of a wild west. Do you have any thoughts on sort of how that's evolving? Is risk transfer truly feasible in a way that it provides a level playing field to the pharma companies and to the payers?
I think it is. It's not going to be easy. We're with the managed entry agreements or managed access agreements or performance-based or outcomes-based contracting. I think we're at that stage where we were a couple of years ago with the definition of HTA, is that there's a lot of talk about these types of agreements, but no clear consensus on the approach or how we should do these.
Yeah.
The OECD did a survey, a global survey on managed performance-based managed entry agreements. And what they found was that most of the types of agreements that were in place were strictly financially based, where we talk about rebates, we talk about cap, maybe some more innovative approaches with installment payments, subscription-based pricing and these sorts of things, but true performance-based, where I'll pay you, but if that drug doesn't work on a particular patient, then I want a refund, or I'm not paying you anymore for those drugs. Now, those are really challenging to do. How do you adjudicate them? Who determines if a drug has worked or not? These sorts of things. So lots of issues associated with doing this, and payers are just extremely busy, particularly government payers, to enter into these types of agreements. So again, they're looking for some support, some help to maybe move some of these more innovative thinking approaches forward. Yeah.
What is your vision of the future? Where do you think we should be headed? What should we be aiming for as a pharmaceutical industry, as HTA, as payers? What does that vision look like?
Yeah, so first off, let me just explain as well that most payers, most people in the HTA business also are supportive of having a healthy life sciences sector. We all get that. We recognize that some profit has to be made so that they can reinvest that profit into new innovation, new developments. And we just saw that through the COVID pandemic and the development of the vaccine, how important life sciences is
so fast
to our health, so fast.
Yeah.
And so that to me is a basic principle that we do need to continue to work on. From my perspective, the new vision for the entire life sciences sector, the health technology assessment, the payer community, the regulators, is a lot more harmonization, global harmonization, a lot more collaboration happening amongst the various stakeholders, a lot more engagement of the ultimate beneficiaries of these technologies, the patients and the clinicians that work for them. And we do need to get into more of the paying for what works. Some of these new technologies you mentioned, the gene therapies, the CAR T cells, et cetera, have very significant upfront costs. They're being marketed as potential cures for cancers and for other diseases, et cetera. Some of these drugs for rare diseases, astounding costs for some of these products with very limited evidence. So how do we manage that uncertainty while still trying to bring some of this innovation to market and getting it to patients in an equitable fashion and in an early fashion where there does look like there's promise? So to me, it is all about that life cycle approach, a management approach to these technologies with good discussion in that pre-market phase with the manufacturers, the HTA agencies, the payers, the patients, and the regulators, making a decision on the evidence as it comes forward, recognizing there is going to be lots of uncertainty, and how do we address and communicate that uncertainty? And we have to put conditions on that initial recommendation, whether it's at the regulator level or the payer level from a reimbursement perspective, and getting into these performance-based contracting. To me, that's crucial.
Well, I think we hear from the industry as well, the desire to understand and anticipate before they make these investments in new therapies. What is the reimbursement landscape going to be like? So we're not, caught unawares. Our investors think this and this other thing is what actually happens. So it's about clarity on how are things going to, what is the world going to look like if we're successful?
And that's a really important point, Nathan. And maybe some advice that I would give to those in the pharmaceutical industry is make sure you're having these early conversations, not just with regulators, but with the HTA agencies and the payers. And maybe it's just with the HTA agencies who will be there for a proxy for the payers. But having those conversations about value, about the economics, about the comparators that need to be used in those early dialogues before you invest heavily in that phase 3 clinical study. you need to find out what type of information will be necessary for a payer to provide reimbursement. So come and talk to the NICE, to the UNETA agencies, to CADTH, to PBAC in Australia, to TLV in Sweden. These are the groups in Germany that will give you advice on how to design your clinical trials, so they do give the information that's needed for a payer.
Yeah. No, that's a really good point. I mean, we've all seen the stories of companies that just had outsized expectations when they entered the market, and it's best to have our expectations understood ahead of time, by engaging with the payers ahead of time. If we're able to do this incredible thing, what does that look like? How does that fit in? And it's not just to get an understanding of what to promise your shareholders, it's also to give payers a heads up. This is coming down the pike. You got to allocate some budget for this new incredible therapy that's going to transform health outcomes in your jurisdiction. You need a few billion extra dollars in your budget, right?
In fact, that's another good point. That's an area that we do try and do more of in the HTA community, is that horizon scanning. Where is the innovation coming? Where is it going? And let's prepare the ground ahead of time. Government payers in particular work on 2-year budget cycles, sometimes even longer than that, and it takes a while to get that machinery working.
A radical thought: see the HTA agency is on your side to help prepare the budgets so that they can reimburse your groundbreaking treatment. So cool. Well, thank you so much for your time. One more question for you, Brian. The series is called Contingently Committed. Tell me about a contingent commitment in your life.
Well, I think the contingent commitments that we all make to our family. We want our children to succeed, and we're always going to be there to provide those contingencies or the benefits that help them succeed in their life. To me, that's one of the key areas, whether it's in their health, in their employment, in their own children. I have 2 grandchildren now, so how things are moving forward. So putting those contingencies forward, but not necessarily taking over, letting them grow, learn, and make their own mistakes, but always being there for them. In any type of negotiations or contingency platform, everybody talks about, I want to win this negotiation. Well, it's not about winning, it's about having everybody win. When you come out of a negotiation, a deal, something in your own personal life, everybody probably needs to feel a little bit, well, I didn't get everything that I wanted here, but I'm happy with that.
Yeah, I guess a subset of a contingent commitment is an unconditional commitment that provides a baseline of stability and support.
And how far you're willing to go as well.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for your time today, Brian.
Okay. Thanks very much, Nathan.